It sounds like you've got a story about someone with unbelievable nerve. Imagine a woman walking away from her little boy when he was only 4 years old, disappearing without a trace for nearly 22 years, and then suddenly returning with an expensive attorney, a polished smile, and the confidence to claim she was only looking out for her son's best interests. It sounds unbelievable, but I know every detail because I lived through it myself. And if you think you've already figured out how this story ends, trust me, you haven't even scratched the surface. My name is Jack Mercer. I'm 56 years old, and every morning starts exactly the same way for me. A mug of strong black coffee, and a few quiet minutes before the day begins. For more than 2 decades, I've been the only parent my son has ever truly had. His name is Ethan Mercer, and when I call him my son, I don't mean it because of biology alone. I mean it because I was there every single day that mattered. I was the one who drove him to every therapy appointment, no matter how exhausted I was after work. I was the one sitting alone at every school meeting, listening to teachers explain new goals and challenges while the chair beside me stayed empty year after year. I was the one who spent countless nights sitting on the floor outside his bedroom, because hearing my breathing helped him feel safe enough to sleep. Being a father isn't something a DNA test proves. It's something you earn every single day by showing up, especially when nobody else does. To understand how everything eventually unraveled, you first have to know where it all began. I met Lauren Brooks when I was 31. She had this energy that drew everyone toward her, without even trying. She was funny, confident, and had a way of making every conversation feel important. Whenever she looked at you, it felt like you were the only person in the room. We fell in love fast, maybe faster than we should have. Looking back now, I can admit we probably rushed into marriage before we truly knew each other. About a year later, our son Ethan was born. When he was just 3 years old, doctors diagnosed him with autism. I want to make one thing perfectly clear before I go any further. Ethan's diagnosis was never the tragedy. The real tragedy was how some people chose to react to it. My son has always been one of the smartest, kindest, and most fascinating people I've ever known. His mind works differently, but in ways that constantly amaze me. He notices details most of us never see and understands patterns that completely escape everyone else. Lauren, though, she didn't see any of that. The diagnosis wasn't something she accepted as another step in our family's journey. Instead, she looked at it like someone had stolen the future she'd imagined for herself. I didn't notice it all at once. It happened slowly. She stopped laughing with Ethan. She quit sitting beside him while he played. Conversations became shorter, and she'd spend more time staring out windows than looking at either of us. The distance kept growing until it filled the entire house. The strange part was that she never once mentioned leaving. Not during an argument. Not after a difficult doctor's visit. Not even during our quiet evenings together. Then one ordinary Wednesday morning, everything changed forever. Ethan was sitting on the kitchen floor, happily arranging his colored pencils into perfect rows. He could spend an hour making sure every shade lined up exactly the way he wanted, and watching him concentrate always made me smile. Lauren leaned over, kissed my cheek, grabbed her purse, and casually said she was heading to the supermarket. That was the last time I saw her for more than 2 decades. She didn't go shopping. She drove away with a co-worker named Daniel, leaving behind her husband and a little boy who couldn't understand why his mother never came home. For nearly a week afterward, Ethan walked to our front door several times a day. He'd slowly open it, stare down the driveway, wait quietly for a few minutes, and then close it again. He never cried. He never asked questions. He just waited. Those days are memories I don't revisit often because there aren't enough words to describe that kind of heartbreak. Some pain settles so deeply inside you that talking about it never really makes it lighter. So I picked up the pieces and kept moving. I worked long hours as an electrician during the day, and every evening I buried myself in books, online resources, and support groups, trying to become the father Ethan needed. I learned every one of his routines. I figured out what sounds overwhelmed him and what little habits helped calm him down. I even memorized exactly how his favorite blanket had to be folded before bedtime, because if one corner wasn't tucked the right way, neither of us would be getting much sleep that night. Little by little, we built a life together. It wasn't always easy, but it was ours. As the years passed, I discovered that Ethan expressed himself far better through pictures than through conversations. While most kids filled notebooks with words, he filled sketchbooks with images that somehow said more than entire speeches ever could. His drawings weren't just good. They carried emotion in a way I had never seen before. By the time he turned 8, our refrigerator, the hallway, and half the living room walls were covered with his artwork. Friends who stopped by would spend several minutes studying the pictures before saying anything else. A couple years later, visitors weren't just complimenting his talent anymore. They were asking if they could buy some of his work. When Ethan reached 15, one of his paintings was featured at a major art auction in Chicago. Nobody expected what happened next. The bidding climbed higher and higher until the final hammer dropped at $3.4 million. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I'd heard the auctioneer wrong. I remember walking into the parking garage afterward, completely overwhelmed. The moment the doors closed behind me, every ounce of strength I'd been holding on to disappeared. I cried harder than I ever had in my life. Not the kind of tears you quietly wipe away. I mean the kind that shake your whole body until you can barely breathe. I wanted to call someone and tell them what had happened. Then it hit me. There wasn't anyone. For all those years, it had only been Ethan and me. He quietly stepped beside me, rested his hand on my shoulder, and waited until I finally looked at him, with that calm expression he'd always had. He smiled just a little and said, "Dad." I knew someone would understand what I was trying to paint. I laughed through the tears. That was Ethan. He never cared about the money. To him, the painting had simply found someone who appreciated it. A few weeks later, he casually explained why he thought the artwork had sold for that amount. He'd been studying market trends, collector behavior, and investment patterns in contemporary art. He broke everything down like a college professor giving a lecture. I just stared at him. Then I burst out laughing. Sometimes I forgot I was raising a teenager, because he often sounded like someone twice my age. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. The attention surrounding his artwork grew, but inside our home, almost nothing changed. We still ate dinner together every evening. I still made pancakes on Sunday mornings. He still spent hours under the giant maple tree in our backyard, sketchbook balanced across his knees, while the world faded into the background. For the first time in years, I honestly believe the hardest part of our lives was finally behind us. I couldn't have been more wrong. About 16 months after Ethan's record-breaking auction, my phone rang while I was cleaning out the garage. The caller introduced herself as Melissa Grant, an attorney. Her voice was polished, confident, and so perfectly controlled that every sentence sounded rehearsed. "Mr. Mercer," she began, "I'm contacting you regarding concerns about the financial management of Ethan Brooks." I stopped her before she could continue. "My son's last name is Mercer," I said firmly. There was a brief silence on the other end. "Of course," she replied smoothly. "However, my client believes there are serious questions regarding the handling of Ethan's income." Something about the way she carefully chose every word made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I slowly sat down on an old workbench. "And exactly who is your client?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Finally she answered, "Lauren Brooks." For a second, everything around me seemed to go completely silent. I wasn't angry. Not immediately. I wasn't shocked, either. The feeling was something much stranger, like the ground beneath me had suddenly disappeared while I was still standing. I honestly didn't know whether to laugh or throw the phone across the garage. Instead, I stayed perfectly calm. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "Would you mind repeating that name?" She did. Hearing it a second time somehow made it even more unbelievable. Melissa explained that Lauren intended to file legal paperwork claiming she'd become concerned about Ethan's financial well-being. According to her, my ex-wife believed I had been taking advantage of Ethan's success for my own benefit because she was his biological mother. She intended to ask the court for authority to oversee his assets. The attorney even had the nerve to say there were serious concerns about whether Ethan's best interests had been properly protected. I lowered the phone into my lap. For several long moments, I simply stared out through the open garage door. Across the backyard, Ethan sat beneath his favorite maple tree exactly where he always did. His headphones were on. A pencil moved steadily across another blank page. He looked completely peaceful, untouched by the storm that had just entered our lives. I picked the phone back up. "My advice," I said calmly, "is to tell your client she's welcome to try." I ended the call without another word. 3 days later, my life exploded. Within 3 days, my name was everywhere. I still have no idea how Lauren managed to move so quickly. Maybe she had connections. Maybe she spent a fortune hiring the right people. Or maybe the media couldn't resist a headline about a successful autistic teenage artist supposedly being exploited by his own father. Whatever the reason, the story spread like wildfire. By Thursday morning, people all over the country were talking about me. Neighbors started calling. Old co-workers reached out asking what was going on. My supervisor wanted answers before I even got to work. Around 7 o'clock that morning, a television reporter knocked on my front door with a cameraman standing behind her, smiling as though she were stopping by for a friendly visit instead of trying to catch someone in the middle of a family disaster. But the headlines weren't the worst part. Lauren hadn't returned empty-handed. She came armed with what looked like convincing evidence. There were documents that supposedly showed I had manipulated auction schedules for Ethan's artwork. Someone had created emails that appeared to come from my address, making it seem like I negotiated expensive sales without Ethan's approval. There were fake financial records, questionable contracts, even timelines that had been carefully edited to make every event look suspicious. Whoever put everything together knew exactly what they were doing. The entire story painted Lauren as the worried mother who had finally come back to rescue her vulnerable son from an abusive father who was getting rich off his talent. It was polished, it was believable, and worst of all, people believed it before I'd even had a chance to defend myself. Overnight, I became the villain. According to the public, I was a greedy father who had spent years taking advantage of a disabled kid who trusted me completely. That Thursday night, I sat alone at the kitchen table scrolling through article after article. Every headline made my stomach sink a little further. For the first time in years, I felt genuine fear. Not because I thought I was going to lose. The truth was on my side. I was terrified of what all this attention would do to Ethan. He'd spent years building a peaceful life, carefully creating routines that made him feel secure. Now strangers were dragging his name across television screens and social media, turning our private lives into entertainment. That thought hurt far more than anything being said about me. The next morning, my attorney, Michael Carter, came over to the house. Michael had practiced family law for more than 25 years, and I'd never seen him look so serious. He spread several folders across the dining room table before looking directly at me. "Jack," he said carefully, "they planned this well. We need to move fast." I nodded. "I'll prepare public statements. We'll request independent financial audits. Gather every record you've ever kept, and line up people who can speak on your behalf." "I've already got the records," I answered. He raised an eyebrow. "I've kept everything." And I meant everything. Every therapy invoice, every doctor's appointment, every receipt, every school report, every bank statement connected to Ethan's artwork. I never imagined I'd need those boxes again, but I'd save them anyway. I wasn't worried about proving the truth. I was worried about whether anyone would still care once the truth finally came out. While Michael and I talked, neither of us noticed Ethan standing quietly in the hallway. He had his familiar black notebook tucked under one arm. When he finally walked into the kitchen, neither of us spoke. He looked at me, then at Michael, then at my phone lying on the table with another breaking news alert glowing across the screen. His expression didn't change. Most people struggled to read Ethan's emotions. I never did. After all those years together, I could tell exactly what was going through his mind. He wasn't frightened. He wasn't angry. If anything, he looked thoughtful, almost curious, like someone had just handed him a complicated puzzle he couldn't wait to solve. Without saying a word, he pulled out a chair and sat beside us. He opened his notebook. Every page was already filled with neat handwriting, charts, dates, and color-coded notes. Then he calmly looked up. "I've been expecting this," he said. Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" Ethan answered as casually as if he were discussing tomorrow's weather. I started preparing about 8 months ago. I blinked. What? He turned another page. I noticed several legal inquiries connected to my financial accounts months ago. I stared at him. You noticed? He gave me that patient look kids sometimes give their parents when they're trying not to point out something obvious. I monitor my own accounts, he explained. I also created notification alerts. Michael leaned forward. What kind of inquiries? A private investigation. He flipped to another section. Someone hired a research firm that specializes in background investigations. He tapped the page with one finger. They search your employment history, property records, tax filings, and legal background. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And you never told me? He met my eyes. I didn't want you worrying before I had enough information. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Part of me wanted to ask why my 16-year-old son had been quietly investigating the people investigating us. The other part of me couldn't have been prouder if I'd tried. I finally managed a small smile. Okay, I said, show us what you've been working on. Ethan quietly slid the notebook across the table. What I found inside changed everything. The moment I opened that notebook, I realized Ethan hadn't just prepared for a possible legal fight. He had built an entire defense strategy that rivaled anything a professional investigator could have assembled. Every page was organized with unbelievable precision. There were color-coded tabs, chronological timelines, cross-reference notes. Every section pointed to another piece of evidence, making it almost impossible to miss a connection. Michael looked over my shoulder, and I watched his eyebrows climb a little higher with every page we turned. I've never seen anything like this, he muttered. Neither had I. The first section focused entirely on my life with Ethan. It included every medical appointment we'd attended together since he was a little kid. There were therapy schedules dating back more than 15 years, school conference records, copies of every individualized education program meeting. Every single form listed only one parent in attendance. Me. Not once, not a single time, did Lauren's name appear on any of them. Then came a calendar Ethan had secretly maintained for years. It wasn't just a diary. It was a detailed record of every important event in his life. Birthdays, school performances, doctor visits, art competitions, family holidays. Beside each event, he'd written the names of everyone who had been there. The same name appeared over and over again. Mine, Lauren's name, never showed up. Not once. I had to lean back in my chair for a second. I didn't even know he'd been keeping records like that. Then Ethan turned to another section. This one matters more, he said quietly. Michael and I exchanged a glance before looking back down. The heading read, Communication Archive. Inside were folders containing every message, email, voicemail, letter, and legal notice connected to Lauren that Ethan had collected over the years. Some were things I'd forgotten even existed. Others I had never seen before. He explained that whenever anything involving Lauren appeared, he'd save multiple copies, digital backups, printed copies, external hard drives, cloud storage. Nothing had been left to chance. Then he handed me a printed transcript. You should listen to the recording later, he said. It explains everything. The voicemail had been left almost 5 years earlier. Lauren had apparently called an old phone number connected to one of Ethan's email accounts, never realizing he still had access to it. I pressed play. Her voice filled the kitchen. At first, she sounded nervous, then tired. Eventually, the truth started spilling out. She admitted she couldn't handle raising a child with special needs. She said she convinced herself that leaving had been the best decision for everyone. She hoped Ethan had been taken care of, but she had no intention of coming back. She actually said those words. Out loud. I sat there frozen. That message had existed for years. Ethan had been carrying it by himself without ever telling me. He quietly explained that he preserved the recording in 3 separate locations and even had it officially authenticated through an online digital verification service. Michael slowly removed his glasses. Jack. His voice barely came out above a whisper. I think your son just destroyed her entire case. But Ethan wasn't finished. Not even close. He flipped another page. I knew she would rely only on the courtroom, he explained. She'd want public opinion first. Michael looked genuinely curious. So you expected the media campaign? Ethan nodded. It was predictable. He calmly pointed towards several charts. They needed people to believe the accusations before evidence became available. I blinked. So what do we do? He answered immediately. We don't respond all at once. Michael frowned. What do you mean? If we release everything today, reporters will choose one or two details and ignore the rest. He tapped another page. But if we release one verified document every day, he looked at both of us. They'll have to keep covering the story. The room went silent. It wasn't just a clever idea. It was brilliant. Each new piece of evidence would build on the previous one until the entire narrative collapsed under its own weight. Michael stared at Ethan for several long seconds. Where did you learn this? Ethan shrugged. I read a lot. That answer made me laugh despite everything happening around us. Of course it did. He probably studied crisis management the same way other teenagers watch football highlights. Within hours, Michael contacted 2 additional attorneys who specialized in defamation and media law. After reviewing Ethan's evidence, they agreed with his strategy almost immediately. The plan was simple. Release one undeniable fact every single day. No emotional interviews. No dramatic speeches. Just verified evidence. Day 1. Attendance records from Ethan's schools covering more than 15 years. Every meeting. Every conference. Every signature. Mine. Day 2. Medical bills and therapy invoices showing I'd personally handled every expense throughout his childhood. Day 3. A short personal statement written by Ethan himself. It wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional. It simply described the life he'd lived. The father who had always been there, and the mother who had chosen not to be. Reading it broke my heart. It also happened to be impossible to argue with. Day 4. The authenticated transcript of Lauren's voicemail. Once reporters heard her own voice admitting she had willingly walked away, everything started changing. The headlines became noticeably different. People who had condemned me only days earlier suddenly began asking very different questions. Instead of wondering whether I'd exploited my son, they started wondering why a woman who had abandoned him for more than 20 years had suddenly reappeared the moment his artwork became worth millions. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, the truth was finally catching up. By the end of the first week, it felt like the entire story had flipped upside down. The same reporters who had been calling me a greedy father were suddenly digging into Lauren's past. Television panels stopped debating whether I'd stolen from my son and started asking why a woman who had disappeared for over 20 years believed she deserved a say in his life now that he was successful. The momentum had completely shifted. Every morning, another carefully documented piece of evidence was released, just as Ethan had planned. And every afternoon, another article appeared correcting something that had been reported earlier. Michael called me almost daily. You won't believe this, he'd say. Then he'd tell me another newspaper had issued a correction, another television station had apologized, or another journalist had contacted him asking for copies of Ethan's documentation. It was happening exactly the way Ethan predicted. Lauren's legal team tried to stop the damage. They released statements claiming our evidence was an attempt to manipulate public opinion. They accused us of turning private family matters into a media circus. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. After all, they were the ones who had invited the cameras in the first place. When Ethan read one of those statements, he barely reacted. He simply nodded once. They're losing control of the narrative, he said. That's why they're getting emotional. I honestly couldn't believe how calm he remained through all of it. While lawyers argued, reporters chased headlines, and social media exploded with opinions, Ethan stuck to his routine. Every afternoon, he'd carry a sketchbook outside and settle beneath the big maple tree in our backyard. He'd spend hours drawing as if nothing unusual was happening. Sometimes I'd watch him through the kitchen window. The world around us felt like complete chaos. Yet somehow, sitting beneath that tree, he managed to create his own little pocket of peace. One evening, I carried 2 glasses of lemonade outside. I handed him one and sat beside him in the grass. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were birds settling into the trees and the soft scratching of his pencil across the paper. Finally, I broke the silence. Are you doing okay? He kept sketching. I'm fine. I studied him for a moment. Really, this time he stopped drawing. He looked toward the sunset before answering. She hurt me years ago. His voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact. When I was little, I kept hoping she'd come back. He paused for several seconds. That stopped a long time ago. I didn't interrupt. I've already lived through losing her, he continued quietly. She can't do it to me again. Those words hit me harder than anything I'd heard during the entire case. He wasn't speaking with anger. He wasn't trying to sound tough. He was simply telling me the truth. The little boy who used to wait by the front door had grown into a young man who no longer expected anything from the woman who had walked away. I felt my throat tighten. I wish I could have protected you from all of that. I admitted. He finally looked at me. You did. I frowned. I couldn't stop her from leaving. No, he said softly, but you stayed. That single sentence carried more weight than an hour-long conversation ever could. I reached over and squeezed his shoulder. Neither of us spoke again for a while. We didn't need to. A few days later, Michael called with an update. The judge scheduled the final hearing for next Thursday. I thanked him and hung up. The house suddenly felt very quiet. Everything we'd been working toward was finally close. The night before the hearing, Ethan found me sitting in the living room. He closed the door behind him and took a seat across from me. I've made a decision, he said. I looked up from my coffee. What kind of decision? I want to give her one opportunity to walk away. I wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. You mean settle? He nodded. I'll offer not to pursue any additional legal action. I stared at him. After everything she'd done, I couldn't understand why he'd even consider it. He must have seen the question on my face. This isn't for her, he explained. It's for me. I stayed quiet. If she accepts, he continued, this ends peacefully. And if she doesn't, for the first time all week, he hesitated. Then he looked toward the hallway leading to his studio. Then I'll show everyone the paintings. I frowned. What paintings? He slowly stood up. Without saying another word, he walked down the hall. A minute later, he returned carrying a large portfolio case I'd never seen before. He carefully laid it on the coffee table. I've kept these private for years. He opened the case just enough for me to see stacks of canvases separated by protective paper. There are 10 of them. I looked at him. What are they? He took a slow breath. My story. At that moment, I had no idea what he meant. I only knew one thing. Whatever was inside that portfolio, Lauren had absolutely no idea it existed. And somehow, deep down, I had a feeling those paintings were going to change everything. The morning of the hearing, I woke up before the alarm. It was 4:45 a.m., and even though the house was completely silent, my mind was already racing through every possible scenario. I've always had the bad habit of preparing for the worst. It doesn't solve anything, but somehow my brain insists on doing it anyway. I got out of bed, headed to the kitchen, and started a fresh pot of coffee. When I walked in, Ethan was already there. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit he'd picked out himself a few weeks earlier. His black notebook rested beside his plate, and 2 slices of toast sat waiting on the table. He looked up at me. I figured you'd be awake. I smiled. You know me too well. I've had practice. That made me laugh. We sat together without saying much. That was always our way. We'd never been the kind of father and son who felt the need to fill every quiet moment with conversation. Sometimes silence says everything. After breakfast, Ethan closed his notebook and looked directly at me. Before we leave, he said, there's something I need you to hear. I nodded. He took a deep breath. You spent years blaming yourself because she left. I felt my chest tighten. You still think about those days when I was little. I looked away. He was right. Not a week had gone by in more than 20 years that I hadn't replayed those memories. I should have seen it coming, I admitted quietly. I should have protected you. Ethan gently shook his head. No. His voice was calm but firm. You didn't abandon me. I looked back at him. That's the only part of the story that really matters. I couldn't answer. There simply weren't any words. A few minutes later, We grabbed our coats and headed downtown. The courthouse stood in the middle of the city like every courthouse I'd ever seen. Tall, gray, and intimidating enough to make anyone feel nervous before they even stepped inside. Lauren was already waiting near the entrance. She wasn't alone. Her attorney surrounded her, all dressed in expensive suits and wearing expressions that suggested they still believed they were in control. She looked polished, confident, almost exactly the way she had looked the day she walked out of our house all those years earlier. For a moment, our eyes met. I expected to feel anger. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing. No hatred, no bitterness, no desire for revenge. She was simply a stranger who happened to know my name. Then she looked at Ethan. For the briefest second, something crossed her face. Regret. It disappeared almost instantly. Ethan acknowledged her with a polite nod. The kind of nod you'd give someone holding a door open. Nothing more. I noticed her shoulders stiffen. That tiny gesture seemed to hurt her more than any angry speech ever could. The hearing began promptly at 9 o'clock. Over the next 2 hours, Michael carefully dismantled every accusation Lauren's legal team presented. Every claim they made was answered with documents. Every allegation was met with records. Every question had an answer supported by evidence. Watching it unfold was almost surreal. Instead of a courtroom battle, it felt like watching someone patiently complete a puzzle, while everyone else slowly realized the picture had never matched their version of events. By late morning, even the judge's expression had changed. She'd listened carefully from beginning, but now it was obvious she could see exactly where the truth was leading. During a short recess, Ethan quietly stood up. "It's time," he said. His attorney handed Lauren's lawyer a sealed envelope. Inside was Ethan's final offer. If Lauren agreed to withdraw every legal claim, permanently give up any future attempt to control his finances or personal life, and leave without another public accusation, Ethan would end the matter completely. No further statements. No civil lawsuit. No public humiliation. He was offering her one last chance to walk away with dignity. Lauren read every word. She whispered with her attorneys for several minutes. Then she slowly looked across the hallway at Ethan. Without saying anything, she shook her head. She believed he was bluffing. She was wrong. Ethan calmly reached for the large portfolio he'd brought with him. He handed it to his attorney. "I think it's time." The paintings were carefully placed before the court. 10 canvases. 10 years. Each one painted on his birthday. Each one telling the same story from a different stage of his life. The first showed a little boy reaching toward a woman, disappearing into the distance. Bright colors still filled the canvas. There was hope. The second painting was quieter. The woman stood farther away. The colors had already begun fading. Every year she became smaller. Every year the distance between them grew wider. Eventually, she disappeared completely. The final painting showed only a peaceful backyard at sunrise, a porch, a steaming cup of coffee, a large maple tree. And beneath that tree sat a young man, drawing quietly while sunlight filtered through the branches. Written neatly across the bottom corner were 4 simple words: "I already have enough." The courtroom fell completely silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the attorney seemed unable to find words. I looked toward Lauren. Tears filled her eyes as she stared at the paintings. For the first time since she'd returned, the confidence she'd carried into court was gone. All that remained was a realization that she'd missed more than 20 years of her son's life, and no lawsuit could ever give those years back. She quietly leaned toward her attorney. A few moments later, her legal team informed the judge that the petition was being withdrawn in its entirety. Just like that, it was over. No dramatic speeches. No final argument. Lauren stood, gathered her things, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. I watched the doors close behind her. Then I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for decades. Outside, the crisp autumn air felt lighter somehow. Ethan stood beside me on the courthouse steps. For several minutes, we simply watched people pass by. Finally, I asked, "How are you feeling?" He thought about it before answering. "Free." I smiled. "I think I know exactly what you mean." He glanced at me. "So?" I laughed. "You're hungry? You only had toast." That made me laugh even harder. You're right. We walked to our favorite diner a few blocks away. The waitress greeted us by name before we even sat down. She already knew Ethan's usual order. Some things never change. As sunlight poured through the front windows, Ethan opened a brand new sketchbook. Without saying a word, he started drawing again. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and watched him work. At that moment, I realized something. The greatest thing I'd ever given my son wasn't money, opportunities, or protection. It was simply being there, showing up every single day. And if I had the chance to live my life all over again, I'd choose him every single time. Winning the case didn't magically fix everything. People like to think that once a judge rules in your favor, life immediately goes back to normal. That's not how it works. A courtroom can settle legal arguments, but it can't erase years of hurt. Healing doesn't happen the moment a gavel comes down. It takes time. About a week after the hearing, I noticed something different. For the first time in months, I woke up without my heart racing. No nightmares. No replaying the courtroom in my head. No imagining another phone call from another attorney. Just silence. The kind of silence our house used to have before all this started. I made my usual cup of black coffee and stepped onto the back porch just as the sun was beginning to rise. The morning air was cool, and a light breeze drifted to the branches of the old maple tree in the backyard. A minute later, the screen door creaked open. Ethan walked outside carrying his sketchbook in one hand and a mug of hot tea in the other. Without saying a word, he sat beside me. That was always our language. Most fathers and sons fill quiet moments with conversation. We never had to. After a few minutes, he finally spoke. You know what's strange? I looked over at him. What? He stared out across the yard before answering. I don't wait anymore. I knew exactly what he meant. He wasn't talking about the lawsuit. He wasn't talking about the reporters. And he definitely wasn't talking about the money. He was talking about his mother. For years, even after he'd stopped mentioning her, a small part of him had still been waiting. Waiting for a birthday card. Waiting for a phone call. Waiting for an apology that never came. That part of him was finally gone. Does it feel different? I asked quietly. He nodded. It feels lighter. I smiled. I'm glad. So am I. We sat there watching the sunrise, and somehow that simple moment meant more to me than winning the case ever had. Over the next few weeks, the media slowly moved on. New scandals replaced ours. The television crews disappeared. Reporters stopped calling. Social media found another story to argue about. Honestly, I couldn't have been happier. I never wanted attention. I never wanted interviews. All I wanted was my peaceful life back. One afternoon, Michael called with another update. I thought you want to know, he said. Know what? The investigators finished reviewing Lauren's evidence. I leaned back in my chair, and they confirmed several of the documents were fabricated. That didn't surprise me. The fake emails, the altered financial records, the forged timelines. Experts had verified that none of them were authentic. I thanked Michael for letting me know. After I hung up, I realized something. A few months earlier, hearing that news would have felt like a huge victory. Now, it didn't feel like anything at all. I wasn't interested in revenge anymore. I didn't care whether Lauren apologized. I didn't care whether people judged her. The only thing that mattered was that she no longer had the power to disrupt our lives. That chapter was over. A few weekends later, Ethan and I decided to clean out the attic. It had become a storage space for nearly 20 years of memories. Old toys, school projects, photo albums, birthday cards, boxes full of little things I'd never been able to throw away. As I sorted through everything, I picked up a tiny pair of sneakers Ethan had worn when he was 4. They fit in the palm of my hand. I couldn't help but laugh. It feels like yesterday, I said. Ethan looked over. What does? I remember teaching you how to tie these. He smiled. And now you're teaching lawyers how to prepare a case. That earned a quiet laugh from both of us. A little later, he picked up one of the first drawings he'd ever made for me. Stick figures. A crooked little house. A giant tree that looked more like a green cloud. Across the top, in shaky handwriting, were the words, Me and Dad. He stared at it for a long moment. "You kept this." "I kept everything." He looked at me and smiled. "I'm really glad you did." About a month after the trial, Ethan held his first gallery exhibition since everything had happened. This time, it was exactly the way he wanted it. No television cameras, no reporters, no interviews, just friends, local artists, collectors, teachers, and people who genuinely appreciated his work. The atmosphere felt peaceful. People took their time looking at each painting instead of rushing to capture photos for social media. As the evening came to an end, an older gentleman approached me. He'd spent nearly 20 minutes standing in front of Ethan's newest painting without saying a word. Finally, he turned toward me. "I don't know your son," he said, "but I know one thing." "What's that?" He smiled gently. Someone loved that young man very well. I felt my throat tighten. "What makes you say that?" He looked back at the painting. "You can always tell." He paused before continuing. "People paint what they've lived." After shaking my hand, he quietly walked away. I stood there for a long time thinking about what he'd said. Out of everything that had happened over the past 22 years, out of all the headlines, courtrooms, paintings, and victories, those few words meant more to me than anything else. Because in that moment, I realized something I'd never fully allowed myself to believe. Maybe I hadn't been the perfect father. Maybe I'd made plenty of mistakes along the way. But I had given my son the one thing he needed most. I stayed. And sometimes that's enough. Life is a funny way of reminding you what really matters. A few months after everything was over, our lives settled into the kind of routine I'd missed more than I ever realized. There were no reporters parked outside the house. No attorneys calling every other day. No breaking news alerts with my name splashed across the screen. It was just the two of us again. Exactly the way we'd always been. One Saturday morning, Ethan and I drove out to a small lake about an hour from home. We'd been going there since he was a little kid. It wasn't anything special to most people. A quiet dock, a handful of fishing boats, and an old diner just down the road. But to us, it had always been our place. We sat at the end of the dock with our feet hanging over the water. Neither of us had brought fishing poles. We weren't there to catch anything. We just wanted to enjoy the silence. After a while, Ethan reached into his backpack and handed me a small wrapped package. "What's this?" I asked. "You'll see." I peeled back the paper and found a simple wooden picture frame. Inside was one of his newest sketches. It wasn't a $1 million painting. It wasn't something meant for an auction or a gallery. It was just a pencil drawing. The picture showed our back porch early in the morning. 2 chairs, 2 coffee mugs, the maple tree glowing in the first light of day. And sitting in those chairs were 2 figures, a father and his son. At the bottom of the page, written in Ethan's neat handwriting, were 6 simple words. Home was never a place. It was you. I couldn't say anything. My vision blurred before I even realized tears were filling my eyes. "I figured," Ethan said with a small smile, "that this one belongs to you." I looked at him. "You've already given me more than I ever deserved." He shook his head. "No." He paused. "You gave me the chance to become the person I wanted to be." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The lake was perfectly still. A light breeze rippled across the water, and somewhere in the distance a bird called out before everything grew quiet again. I thought back over the last 22 years. The sleepless nights, the therapy appointments, the school meetings, the birthdays we celebrated together, the holidays when it was just the two of us, the nights I wondered whether I was doing enough, the mornings I got up anyway because someone depended on me. Looking back, I realized something. I had spent so many years worrying about whether I'd failed as a father that I'd never stopped to see what we'd actually built together. We had built a home, not a perfect one, but a safe one, a place where Ethan never had to question whether someone would be there when he woke up. That was worth more than every headline, every courtroom victory, and every painting that had ever sold. As we drove home that afternoon, Ethan looked out the passenger window and quietly said, "You know, people keep asking me where I find inspiration. What do you tell them?" He smiled. "I tell them I grew up watching Ordinary Kindness." I laughed. That sounded a lot more impressive than it really was. He shook his head. I don't think you understand. He turned toward me. You spent 22 years teaching me something most people never learn. What's that? He answered without hesitation. Love isn't measured by promises. He looked back out the window. It's measured by who keeps showing up. I don't think he ever realized how much those words meant to me. Sometimes people ask me if I regret marrying Lauren. The truth is, I don't. If life had unfolded any differently, I might never have had Ethan. And every difficult day, every sacrifice, every lonely night was worth it because it led me to being his father. People also ask whether I ever forgave Lauren. Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. Eventually, I realized it didn't matter. Forgiveness isn't always something you give another person. Sometimes it's the gift you give yourself so you can stop carrying a weight that no longer belongs to you. As for Ethan, he's still painting. He's still creating art that somehow captures feelings most people struggle to put into words. His studio has grown. His career continues to flourish. And collectors still wait years for the chance to own one of his pieces. But my favorite artwork isn't hanging in a museum. It isn't the one that sold for millions. It isn't even the paintings that change the outcome of a courtroom battle. It's the little sketch hanging in my kitchen. 2 chairs, 2 coffee mugs, a quiet morning, and a father sitting beside the son he never stopped choosing. Every single day I walk past that picture, it reminds me of the simplest truth I've ever learned. Being a parent isn't about being perfect. It isn't about having all the answers. It isn't even about never making mistakes. It's about showing up again and again and again, because in the end, children rarely remember the speeches we gave them or the expensive things we bought them. They remember who stayed. And if my story has taught me anything, it's this. You don't have to be extraordinary to change someone's life. Sometimes, all it takes is refusing to walk away.